So, the importance of the role of Texas in all of this is that Texas um, brought the idea of expansion back into the forefront of people's minds. Um, Understand that by the time you get to 1844, um, we've had the Louisiana Purchase for 30 years. You're already starting to have people travel westward. You're starting to have Americans that are getting frustrated with the market economy or frustrated with the lack of land opportunity, and packing up and moving out west, moving to California, moving to Oregon, moving to Utah. You have some of these early trails that you would have talked about in middle school, that people are traveling on. And yes, these are horribly difficult conditions. But initially, the idea of Western expansion was still seen in the context of the Louisiana Purchase. With Texas, you see that begins to be about something bigger. It's not just about settling the Louisiana Purchase. Now it's about getting other territory, and really kind of chomping at the bit to get pieces of what is now Mexico, right? Or what was Mexico, rather. And so bringing Texas to the forefront of the 1844 election, which Tyler does, is interesting because it makes the conversation very friendly to the Democrat Republicans, who are represented by James Polk. And of course, Tyler, who was more Democrat than he was Whig, was going to be very sensitive to this. Remember, this is the whole reason they built this kind of mixed ticket for the Whigs, to try to defeat any Democrats, because there's such bad blood between the Democrats and the Whigs. And so Polk is going to walk away with that election. Now, the issue here is that the Whig Party has been thrown into disarray. The success of Polk, the impact of Tyler, the conflicts between Tyler and Henry Clay, of which we're not going to go off into too much. All of that results in a Whig Party that's very dysfunctional. So we're going to start to see that the Whigs, which are still a presence in Washington, D.C., but they're not a driving presence, if you will. So Polk's election in 1844 is going to mean that we go back to the ideas of the Democrats. Things like smaller tariffs, that we want land speculation, we want land expansion, that we're going to have a treasury that works with state banks as opposed to having a single Bank of the United States to create kind of economic stability. So there's a lot more speculation, a lot more bubbles, where land values and cotton prices get really high and then they collapse. You also have a government that aggressively supports expansion, to the point that they're willing to risk war. Again, you have Oregon. You have lots of American settlers traveling to Oregon. California, you have lots of American merchants that make that trek out there. Of course, we'll talk about the Mormons and how they kind of lead the way to that western area. California merchants who either go by ship and go all the way around South America, or who are brave enough to cross all that territory. And remember, we've got Native Americans on the Great Plains, and of which I mentioned the Comanches when I was talking about Texas. The Comanches are one of those groups. You've got the Apaches, you've got the Cheyenne, you've got the Sioux, and these are tribes that are known for their horsemanship, and for being somewhat powerful within their own kind of ethnicity, if you will. But you have Americans traveling there, beginning to trade, and now you've got Texas, right? And Texas was independent, but the annexation of Texas has now brought about this pesky question of what exactly is the border of Texas? So when Texas is annexed, where does that put the southern border of the United States? And of course, Mexico's looking at this going, how can the United States annex a country that we didn't really recognize their independence in the first place, right? So you've got some really kind of pesky questions about how independent was Texas really? Did they really have the right to do this? To what extent was Mexico just kind of waiting for that thing to play out? Lots of pesky questions going on with all of this. So this return to a democratic agenda is going to mean that we're focused very heavily on foreign policy and expansion. President Polk will, of course, settle the Oregon border with British Canada. And he will then send Mexico kind of a messenger that says, hey, we'd like to buy California, New Mexico from you. Because by this time, California has a fair amount of American immigrants in it. Now, you also have some Tejanos, and understand that the Californios, not Tejan, I said Tejanos tonight. The Californios are actually kind of a well-to-do group, right? They've made use of the labor of the indigenous people of California and really kind of taken advantage of that. And so what's going to happen is Polk wants to purchase California. He wants to purchase New Mexico in order to, of course, now he's looking at this as we've annexed Texas. But Mexico, who's getting kind of irritated that the United States annexed Texas at the dispute over the border, they're going to look at that and say, yeah, no, we're not going to sell you these two places, right? You're pushing your luck with Texas. So what will happen is that you've got some skirmishes happening along the Mexico-Texas border, and Polk will station soldiers along this border. And essentially what they'll do is he places these troops in what is a disputed area. He knows it's disputed. The military knows it's disputed. Why would you put troops in a disputed area? I mean, yes, he's trying to claim it, but he's also trying to entice a conflict. And so Mexico responds to these troops being there, and they attack the Americans, to which Polk turns around to Congress and says, oh my gosh, can you believe they attacked us? How dare they? Even though they were in a disputed area that Mexico thought was their own. And so you have an 1846 declaration of war. So when we talk about kind of the reform groups and some of these groups like the Transcendentalists, the Abolitionists, they get very upset because the Transcendentalists are kind of this religious group that's very much about peace and nature and Henry David Thoreau and all civil disobedience. In fact, your first incidences of civil disobedience happened because of the 1846 declaration of the Mexican-American War. So this is how significant this is for this group of people. So you do have people like Thoreau that are refusing to pay their taxes because they don't want their tax dollars to go towards this conflict. You have abolitionists who see this as clearly a grab for slavery expansion, and they just see that the war is unjust. Now, it's not that the abolitionists necessarily wanted to stop Texas annexation because, after all, they were getting Oregon, but they didn't think that there should be a conflict over it. And the Whigs, of course, who are a hot mess after the election of 1844, don't want to come out too loudly about opposing the conflict. So they kind of give lip service to, well, we can't believe that they attacked us, and maybe we should do something. But really, they're kind of conflicted because they know that this expansion is going to promote kind of this agricultural regionalism that they've been fighting against since, Hamilton. So there's lots of concerns with that. You're going to see that the Mexican-American War, and again, this is just a quick overview. Like, we're not diving off into this a whole bunch. The Mexican-American War is a whole thing in and of itself. We just don't have really the time to really analyze it. But certainly if you're interested, I could recommend some things. And there's some interesting kind of insights in the fact that the Mexican-American War is where a lot of our Civil War generals and such begin to learn to fight. So the Mexican-American War, we invade Mexico. We attack Veracruz, Mexico City. Zachary Taylor comes in. We'll be talking about Zachary Taylor later because he'll be elected president. Taylor will basically kick butt, take names. Mexico is no match for the American military. Mexico, of course, under Santa Anna and some of the subsequent leaders after him, Mexico had struggled to kind of maintain control of the different provinces. They had a system after they did away with constitutional monarchy that was heavily local control, almost Articles of Confederation type of government, and it led to a great deal of problems, right? They were constantly having to deal with these conflicts in these other provinces, much like we saw with our own Articles of Confederation. And so they keep vacillating between this, very local control, weak central government to a too strong central government that has to come in and get control of these provinces. So all of that to say that Mexico is no match for the Americans. And so we very quickly push in, we get control. This is going to lead to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which officially ends the war. Basically, we pay $15 million for Utah, where the Mormons have already settled, Nevada, California, Colorado, and then setting the Texas border along the Rio Grande River. So finalizing this conflict over the Texas border. So now the United States will then be coast to coast. We go beyond what was the Louisiana Purchase. Eventually, we'll come back and we'll purchase kind of part of New Mexico and Arizona. That's called the Gadsden Purchase. But that's kind of ancillary to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we pay them for all of this territory. And this makes the United States go coast to coast. Now, in 1846, right as the Declaration of War comes out, you have some people in Congress that are very concerned about the expansion of slavery, that are essentially trying to add to the Declaration of War that any newly acquired territory would not have slavery. So they're trying to be preemptive, right? Let's not have this whole debate about one slave, one free. Let's just say that any territory we acquire from this Mexican-American War outside of Texas, which is technically already a part of the United States, that any other territory is not going to have slavery. And it doesn't pass. It's not included in the Declaration of War. But you begin to see how this regionalism, this economic system, this economic debate about agriculture, land ownership, Western expansion versus the market economy, strong, stable national government, that kind of thing, how that begins to have kind of a slavery element to it in a very notable way. It's not that slavery wasn't a part of it. It had always been, but it was kind of like that dirty secret nobody talked about. With the Wilmot Proviso, we're starting to talk about the nature of slavery and what are we going to do. Do we want to have slavery drive our conversations from here on out? So, of course, this is going to lead to increasing problems later on. You don't want to forget the Wilmot Proviso, because I think for pro-slavery people, for people that are under the assumption that, slavery was acceptable, that it was justified by God, that, there was racial, kind of genetic justifications for that. Those people are going to be very upset about the Wilmot Proviso. They're going to see that as a power grab to force the country to be less slave state and more free state. And the concern there is that that's going to begin to tilt the economic system against agriculture. That you're going to start to have an economic system that has high tariffs, that has a national bank, that has a strong federal government, and that you're going to have kind of this breakdown of this democratic system. If you think back to the Panic of 1819, that's part of what causes the crisis, that pushes Stephen F. Austin into Texas, right? This concern that this strong centralized government is corrupt and that we can't trust it. And that we should dissolve this power off to local entities. So this is kind of the same argument, but it's in to a different tune, if you will. And it's certainly much more significant now that the United States is coast to coast. And so you want to be sure that you keep in context kind of this emergence of, from the economic factors of the Panic of 1819 and the concerns about a strong economic system, strong federal government, to the development of Texas, to the annexation of Texas, to how that precludes the Mexican-American War, and how the Mexican-American War then brings into stark contrast the groups of people that do not want slavery, that are concerned about expansion, that are concerned about state governments that are less democratic because they ignore the wishes of a group of people, right? So we're starting to have this debate about, well, this group of people are opposed to slavery. This group of people are opposed to, expansion. This group of people's opposed to tariffs. This group of people doesn't believe that we should have a strong national government. So these groups then become these factions. And the problem with these factions is when one faction, in this case the Democrats, take over, they kind of abuse their power and force the other factions to accept what they believe. This is exactly what Madison was talking about in Federalist 10. This is exactly the kind of concern that you saw happening with Hamilton and Jefferson. The problem is that this sectionalism, this concern, this debate that we saw happening between Hamilton and Jefferson has now taken on a life of its own. And the debate is not being held by people like Hamilton and Jefferson who are talking in very philosophical terms. They're being held by people who are greedy, who want territory, who have a political axe to grind, who have political gain that they want. And you have some people that just believe that I want the right to be able to move out west. You have ordinary citizens that maybe aren't as concerned with the philosophical argument, but are certainly far more concerned with, I want, I want my opportunity. I want my shot at the American dream, and how can I possibly get it? So I think that that's kind of an important piece that you want to remember. So I'm going to stop this here and pick up with the Western part.